Welcome to the tip calculator part 2, where we're going to add some JavaScript elements to this. So something I realized I forgot to cover in the last lesson was why we have to specify a type for the button. So when you create a button in a form or outside of a form, there's 3 values that can be created for that button. It's either just a button that does whatever you want it to do and you get to specify what it does, or it's a submit button where it actually sends the form data to something else. So like when you submit a contact sheet and you want to send that off to the website creators, you hit submit and it will submit it off, and that's a default value. And then you have reset, which will actually take all the values inside of any of the form options and completely reset them to their initial values. So I realized I didn't cover that, so I wanted to discuss why we specified a type for the button. What we're going to do now that we have our form created, is we need to add some JavaScript. The JavaScript, what it needs to do is it needs to be able to pull from the form and know what to pull from where so that it can return it and do calculations with it. So we need to use the getElementById method, and that's going to allow us to grab a specified ID over in the form and bring it over to the JavaScript to use it. This is used almost anytime you want to get information, manipulate it, whatever you can from the document. And when I say document, I'm talking about the HTML document or the HTML file. If there's no ID specified, it's going to return with a null or nothing's going to happen. And IDs should be unique within a page because you only want to call upon them once and have them have a unique name. You don't want to get something mixed up. Like if you had multiple forms on the page, you don't want to call them all tip calculator because only one of them should be a tip calculator. So it's really important that when you're coding JavaScript with HTML and CSS that you think about like what is the process that the user needs to go through and how can I break down this process so that I can code the process. First, the user needs to come to the page and input values for the bill amount and the service quality. So we've got the form, we built that, they have area to put that in. Then they're going to click that calculate button that we created. When the button's clicked, we want the calculation of the tip to occur, and then we want the tip to appear on the page. But it's really important to note that there's actually some background stuff that has to happen between the point in which the button is clicked and it returning the value. And actually there's stuff that needs to occur before the button is clicked in the background that we can call upon the second the button is clicked. So what needs to happen is the browser needs to be able to pull information from the form. It needs to be able to pull the amount of the bill as well as the service quality. And it needs to know what to do with those. It needs to know that we need to take the values and multiply them together so we can determine a tip amount, and then we need to display that tip amount. So there's a lot that needs to occur. And then if you think about it, by grabbing those options and turning them into variables, we can then pull them and do calculations with them so that way when the user hits the calculate button, a function of calculating the entire tip occurs and we are able to create it. So at this point, we're going to go ahead and code some JavaScript, and I'm going to use some comments because I think it's important to note in our JavaScript what order things are going to need to occur in. We may code them out of order, but the browser needs to see them in a certain order so that it runs them correctly. So I'm going to go ahead and go to my CodePen that we created in the last lesson. And we're going to go over to JavaScript and begin coding in our JavaScript. And I'm going to kind of minimize my CSS because I don't really need that right now because it just creates this purple right here for this tip calculator. So there's a couple things that we need to do. We need to go ahead and return the value of a calculation. So we need to calculate a tip for the page on the left. We need to have the user, when the user clicks the button, that the calculation occurs. So when the user clicks the button run this function. We're also going to need to create some ways to pull the information from the page. And that's going to actually happen before the calculation. So we're going to pull inputs from the user. And we're going to add some more in here because we've got some more stuff we need to do. So first things first, we need to pull some information from the user and bring it into our JavaScript. So we're going to create a function in our calculation of our tip here. And that function is going to be the overall function we're going to call upon, and it's going to be called calculate tip. And I'm going to specify in this this comment here that this is where the actual calculation occurs, not necessarily calculating the function. So pull inputs from the user and run function. Okay, so it's going to calculate a tip, but to do that, it's got to pull some data. And that data we need to specify and make it equal to something. We can't just pull data and call it nothing in the JavaScript because then it has no way to do anything with it. So to specify a value and utilize that value in like a calculation, we need to create a variable. I'm going to create my first variable of bill amount. And then I'm going to create a second variable called service quality. And I'm going to actually abbreviate that to service qual. Okay, so I've got bill amount and I've got service quality. And if you think about it, I'm going to want to take my bill amount and my service quality, and I'm going to want to do some math with it, right? And that's going to occur right here underneath calculating the tip. So if you think about it, I want to be able to take my bill amount and I want to be able to multiply it, because that would be like a dollar amount. Like I could put in $6 here, right? So if I put in $6 down here and then I choose an option, what I want to happen is I want $6 to multiply by 10% to calculate how much I give to the waiter or waitress, which in this case would be 60 cents, because $6 times 10 is 10% is 60 cents. So I'm going to take bill amount and I'm going to multiply it by service quality. Okay, so this is kind of like we're just creating a basis of what we want to be happening as we move forward. So the biggest question is, how do we get this variable of bill amount to pull from this input over here? Because I type my variable or my amount for bill amount in here, and then I need it to pull from the type text box over into the JavaScript to call upon it. This is where your get element by ID comes into play. So I'm going to go ahead and put an equal sign to say the variable of bill amount is equal to what's over in my HTML document. So we're going to call it document, and what that does is it calls upon the HTML document, and then we put period get element by ID. So go to the HTML document, find the element by ID, specify the ID in the parentheses, and then grab the value that's inside of that form box. Now, the biggest issue we have right now is, how do we call upon this text box over here? At this point, if we put input in here, that actually won't work, because what if we had multiple inputs? What if we asked them for their name? What if we asked them for other things? Those are all input values, so we can't just call it input. Instead, you've got to give it a name. And that's where the ID comes into play, which we talked about before. So an HTML ID can be used in multiple ways, not just to specify something for a form, but you can also do it for stylizing if you wanted to. But the important part about an ID is that it's unique. It only happens once on the HTML file, and that's it. If you're using it in CSS, you would utilize a hashtag before the selector instead of a period like you do for a class. And then you can see inside the tag, it's an attribute with a name. So we're going to go ahead and create those IDs and finish up this calculator. So for input here, after type, I'm going to go ahead and specify a name for this. So I'm going to put an ID equal to bill amount. And over here, instead of input, inside the parentheses to get the element by its ID name, ID, I'm going to type in bill amount. So I'm setting the variable of bill amount to the HTML documents ID of bill amount and the value that gets put in here. And the value, remember, is what the user types in here. So if they type in 10, that's the value it's going to pull. If there's no value here, it just returns null and has no way of knowing anything. We got to do the same thing for our service quality. So down here in our select option, depending on what these are, we're going to have to put a ID equal to service qual. Yep. And actually up here, if you want to use camel case, you can specify bill amount like this. Underneath your ID with camel case, just like we did before with our variable names. And I'm going to do the same thing. It's going to be document.getElementById. And since I just named it service qual, I should be able to name it service qual here and call upon it. And I do want the value of that selector. Now, I think what's important to recognize is that the values here for our options are not numbers. 30% dash outstanding is not a number, it's actually a string. And it's important to note strings and numbers because the strings you can't do math with them. They're a string, they're text, they're not something you can do math with, and the computer doesn't see them as numbers to be able to do math with. So when we want to multiply over here, that's going to become an issue. In addition to that, the value of the service qual is actually different depending on what they pick. So it's not like bill amount where there's one value because they only have one space to type in. They've got a bunch of values they can pick from. So we can solve this problem really quickly by using our value option, and instead of setting a value for each of these options equal to what it says, we can just specify what we want for the math portion of this calculation over here. So we don't actually want 30%, we want the decimal form of it because it's going to be doing a multiplication. It's going to be taking that bill amount and multiplying it by a percentage, also which in math we can use as a decimal point. So we're going to put 0.3 for the value of 30% here. And then we're going to go through and we're going to do that for each one of these to create a value option and solve our problem of converting this from a string into a number. So this one's going to be 0.2, this one's going to be 0.15, this one's going to be 0.1, and this one's going to be 0.05. So now, depending on what they pick as their drop-down menu, when I hit calculate, it's going to come and grab this value right here and bring it over to here to then calculate the amount. Then we're going to go ahead and calculate it. Now, this calculation right here, we can't just have it calculating. We need to give it a name. So we're going to go ahead and give this a variable called total. And that's going to be your bill amount times your service quality. And inside of that total calculation, I'm going to go ahead and put these in parentheses and give it a semicolon to end my statement. All right, so the next thing we're going to want to do is be able to display that value. So we've got this variable, we've got a function, and actually let's make it so when the user clicks it, it runs the function. So when the user clicks the button, we want to calculate everything. So we're going to go ahead and make it so when they actually physically click it, because here's the big thing. You have to have the computer recognize when this is clicked and the mouse goes down. That's called an on-click option. So we're going to be pulling from the pulling information from the HTML file to know when the user clicks and interacts. So we're going to have to pull from the document, and we're going to have to get element by ID again. And we are going to not specify anything yet. And this time, what we have to do is not just to get element by ID with a value, because we're not pulling a value from something. We're actually pulling an event. An event is when something physically occurs on the page from the user. And the event is that the button is clicked. So when we go to the document and we get the ID and on click, I want you to then run the function called calculate tip. And that's going to go ahead and call upon my calculate tip function up here. Now, the question is, what are they clicking? What is it watching for? So over here, I've got a button with a type of button and a form calculator, which makes it talk to this form calculator up here, but it doesn't have an ID to be called upon over in our JavaScript yet. So we're going to go ahead and give it an ID, and that ID is going to be called calculate. And over here, we're going to call it calculate. All right. So at this point, we've got a button. It's clickable. It's supposed to do a function. And at this point, though, it's not returning anything because we haven't told it where to return. So we could put in a value. We could specify an amount. We could hit calculate and nothing happens on our screen because we haven't told it where to go yet. So that's what we're going to go ahead and do in our next video.